Jake had been working as a food delivery driver for years. It was a simple job, riding around the city, dropping off food at people's doors. One rainy night, close to midnight, Jake was on his final delivery of the day. The address was a bit out of town, in an area he had never been to before, an old, decrepit house in the heart of a forgotten neighborhood. He pulled up in front of a rusted iron gate. The gate let out a loud creak as he struggled to open it. The building ahead was large and run down, its windows shattered, and water dripping steadily from the roof's edges with a soft splashing sound. Jake looked at the address on his delivery slip again. It was the right place. Jake hesitated for a moment, but eventually made his way to the front door. He pressed the doorbell, but nothing happened. He rang it again a few more times, but still no response. A bad feeling crept over him, and his heart began to race. Finally, he knocked on the door. The heavy sound echoed through the stone walls of the house. After a brief moment, the sound of slow, heavy footsteps from inside became audible. Jake exhaled, relieved. An old, raspy voice from behind the door called out, "Yes?" It was the voice of an elderly man. Jake replied, "I have food for Johnson." The man responded indifferently, "Leave it at the door." Then the sound of his footsteps gradually faded away. Jake placed the food on the ground and was about to turn away, but suddenly he heard a soft whisper from behind. "Wait." He turned quickly, but saw no one. Only the shadows of the broken windows flickered in the rain's light. Jake felt as if something or someone was watching him from within the house. Quickly, he walked back to his car, his heart pounding harder with each step. When he reached the car, he took out his phone to complete the order and log the payment. But suddenly, a strange message appeared on the screen. "Don't leave. It's not over yet." He stared at the phone, confused. His phone had no internet connection. Jake felt his skin crawl. He quickly tried to make a call, but there was no signal. It was as if he had stepped into a place cut off from time and space. Deciding to leave as fast as he could, Jake started the car and began driving. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, the house never seemed to fade away. No matter how far he drove, it stayed in the mirror, as if the road was looping back on itself. Panicking, he stopped the car and got out, looking around in the pouring rain, trying to make sense of how he was stuck in the same place. Just then, the door of the house creaked open, and a small girl, pale-faced with long black hair, stood in the doorway. Jake, trembling, asked, "What do you want?" The little girl, motionless and expressionless, stared back at him and whispered, "You must complete the final delivery." Jake was utterly confused. He turned to get back into the car, but something stopped him. His foot caught on something. When he looked down, he saw dark, twisted hands reaching up from the ground, gripping his ankle. He struggled, pulling his leg with all his strength, but the hands tightened their grip. Jake began to shout, "Help! Help!" But there was no one. Finally, with a burst of effort, he managed to break free and ran toward his car. He started it again and pressed the gas, but the wheels spun uselessly in place as if the ground itself was holding the car still. Suddenly, a whispering voice came from behind him. "We've been waiting. The final delivery is you." Jake looked over his shoulder and saw the little girl, now joined by several others, pale, lifeless, their bodies decayed, slowly advancing toward him. He couldn't run anymore. Everything around him blurred into darkness. The world around him dissolved into pure emptiness as the whispers grew louder. and his body was slowly dragged into the earth beneath him. That night, Jake never made it back home. No one ever heard from him again. But there was something strange. In the food delivery app, Jake's profile remained active, as though he was still out there, making his final delivery. The final delivery, forever. It was past midnight, and Emily was sitting on her couch, staring blankly at the TV. After a long and exhausting day, she decided to order some food from a local restaurant. She picked up her phone and placed a small order through the delivery app. Normally, she wouldn't order this late at night, but hunger had driven her to break her usual routine. Half an hour passed, and there was still no sign of the delivery driver. Emily checked the delivery status. Strangely, the driver seemed to be on her street, but hadn't moved for several minutes. She waited a bit longer before deciding to call customer support. But just as she picked up her phone, the doorbell rang. Emily jumped a little. She hesitated for a moment before walking to the door. When she opened it, a tall man in a black uniform and cap stood before her. His face was hidden in the shadow of his cap, only his thin, dry lips visible. In a low, cold voice, he said, "Your order." Emily smiled awkwardly and replied, "Thanks. Sorry for ordering so late." The man said nothing, handing her the food in complete silence before turning around and heading down the stairs. Emily watched him from the doorway. There was something odd about him, not just his cold demeanor, but the way he walked. It was as though his footsteps made no sound at all. Emily closed the door and headed to the kitchen, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. She told herself it was just late, and her mind was playing tricks on her. As she opened the bag and placed the food on the table, something else caught her attention. A small card tucked inside the packaging, completely blank. She set the card aside, assuming it was a mistake, and began eating. But the strange feeling wouldn't leave her. After a few bites, she suddenly heard a faint moaning sound from somewhere in the apartment. Emily froze and looked around. The apartment was empty, and there was no one there but her. She was sure of it, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She stood up and began checking each room, but everything was just as she had left it. Still feeling unsettled, she returned to the kitchen. She decided to take another look at the mysterious card. Maybe she had missed something. As she picked it up again, her heart skipped a beat. This time there was writing on it. "You ordered, but I haven't left yet." Emily's pulse quickened. She looked around the room again, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. She grabbed her phone, tried to call customer support, but there was no signal. She turned the phone off and on again, but still nothing. Deciding to lock the door and seek help from outside, she hurried to the front door. But when she reached it, she found it slightly open. She was sure she had closed and locked it before. Nervously, she peeked outside. The street was dark and empty. No one was there. She quickly closed and locked the door again. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger by the minute. She went over to the window, pulling the curtain aside to peer out. There, standing under the dim streetlight, was the delivery man, staring directly at her apartment. He stood motionless. His cold, expressionless face was still hidden beneath the shadow of his cap. Emily immediately pulled the curtain shut and stepped back. Her heart raced with fear. She glanced at her phone again, but there was still no signal. She ran to the door and looked through the peephole. The man had disappeared. Terrified, Emily decided to retreat to her bedroom and lock herself in until morning. No matter how much she tried to convince herself that it was all just in her head, the feeling of dread wouldn't go away. As she opened the bedroom door, the moaning sound echoed through the apartment again, louder and closer this time. Emily, panicking, slammed the bedroom door shut and pressed her back against it. Suddenly, she heard the faint sound of her front door creaking open from the distance. Her breathing grew shallow, and she clutched the door handle tightly. She waited. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving down the hallway towards her grew louder. Each step was careful, almost too soft, as if the person approaching was taking their time. Silence. Complete silence. Suddenly, a faint whisper came from just outside the bedroom door. "I haven't left." Emily was paralyzed with fear. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. She pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle the sound of her own breathing. Her heart pounded against her chest. She didn't know what to do. Then, in the eerie stillness, there was a soft knock on the bedroom door. Emily stood frozen in place, helpless, as she waited. The waiting seemed endless. Morning finally came, but no one ever saw Emily again. The locked door, an empty apartment left behind no trace of her presence. The only thing left was a final message on the delivery app. Order completed. Liam was a new delivery driver, and he was known for getting orders delivered quickly before rushing off to the next one. But tonight fell a little off. It was past 10, and he had just received an order from an address on the outskirts of town, a place he usually didn't venture to. The address was for an old, large house that at first glance looked abandoned. But an order was an order, and despite his unease, Liam set off. When Liam arrived, the street was dark and desolate. The house stood at the end of a long, empty road. The only light came from the dim windows on the first floor. He hesitated, but decided to ring the doorbell. After a few moments, the door creaked open. A young man, dressed in old, dusty clothes, stood at the threshold. His face was pale, and his smile was tired, almost forced. In a low, quiet voice, he asked, "My food?" Liam smiled nervously, handing him the order. "Yeah, here's your food. Could you pay now, please?" The man hesitated for a second, then invited him inside. "Come in. The money's inside. I'll grab it now." Without thinking too much, Liam stepped into the house. The interior was unnervingly cold and still. Old, decaying furniture was scattered around. Liam stayed near the entrance as the man disappeared into another room, supposedly to get the money. As Liam waited, he noticed something odd. He had instinctively closed the door behind him. At that moment, an uneasy feeling began to creep over him. After a few minutes, the young man returned, holding an old wallet. "Sorry," he said softly. "It seems like I don't have enough cash. Would it be alright if I hold on to your card until I can pay you later?" Liam, now more confused than ever, replied, No, we really need to settle this now." Suddenly, a faint sound echoed from upstairs, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the creaky wooden floor. Liam looked up in confusion. "Is someone else here?" The young man smiled that strange, slow smile again. "It's just the house," he said. "It's old, full of memories." Liam's nerves were starting to get the better of him. He needed to leave. He tried to pull the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The handle refused to turn, and the door felt as though it had been locked from the outside. He stammered, "The door. It won't open." The young man remained disturbingly calm. "Don't worry," he said in a soft, eerie voice. "Things around here fix themselves eventually. Maybe you should wait a little." Liam looked around. Everything felt wrong now. The air seemed heavier, and the unsettling feeling that someone, or something, was watching him grew stronger. From upstairs, the slow, heavy footsteps resumed, but this time they seemed closer. Liam finally said, "I really have to go. I got other deliveries." When he turned back toward the young man, he froze. The man's face had changed. It was paler now, his features more shadowed, almost distorted. It was as though the light in the house was slowly swallowing him. The man spoke softly. "No one who comes here leaves easily. Neither will you." Liam took a few shaky steps back toward the door, pounding on it harder now. But the door didn't respond. Suddenly, a soft breathing sound came from behind him. He turned, terrified, but nothing was there, just silence. A low whisper echoed from the far corner of the room. "You'll become one of us." Liam's heart raced. He pressed his hand to his chest, trying to steady his breathing, but the dread was overwhelming. He glanced around wildly, but saw no one. When he turned back to the man, his expression was even more eerie. The young man said quietly, "Many of us are trapped here. There's no way out now." Liam, his voice trembling, asked, Who are you?" The man slowly replied, "I was once like you. I came to this house one day just like you, but now I'm just a shadow. Soon, you will be one of us." Liam ran to the nearest window and tried to open it, but it was sealed shut, just like the door. The harder he pushed, the more hopeless he felt. The sound of footsteps above grew louder, accompanied by low, whispering voices that seemed to come from the very walls of the house. The young man, his voice now barely above a whisper, said, "Don't be afraid. You won't be alone here." Liam turned to face him, but the young man was no longer human. He had become a dark, shadowy figure, a presence that felt ancient and malevolent. The house was consuming him. Liam tried to run toward the door one last time, pounding on it with all his strength, but it wouldn't give. The walls seemed to close in, the whispers growing louder, as if the house itself was alive and pulling him deeper into its grasp. Then everything went silent. The next morning, when a team arrived at the house to follow up on the missing delivery, there was no trace of Liam. The door was open, and the house appeared empty. The only thing they found was a delivery jacket, lying on the floor as if it had been there for years. Ryan was a food delivery driver, doing the job more out of necessity than passion. Tonight, like every other night, he received an order from a large, old house on the outskirts of town. It was already past 10, and Ryan was eager to make this his last delivery of the night. However, something about this order felt strange. The address matched an old mansion that he'd heard rumors about. People said no one had lived there for years. But an order was an order, and Ryan had no choice but to head there. As Ryan rode along the dark, lonely road, he noticed a dim light in the distance. The large, abandoned-looking mansion stood at the end of the street, with a faint glow emanating from one of the windows. But just as he was about to reach the driveway, another scooter pulled up beside him. A man, wearing a delivery uniform like his, parked next to Ryan. The stranger, with a helmet obscuring most of his face, smiled warmly and said, "Hey, looks like we're both delivering to the same place." Ryan glanced at the man, confused. It was odd for two delivery drivers to show up at the same house at the same time. But he shrugged it off. thinking it might just be a glitch in the system. The man gestured toward his own delivery bag and said, "Let's head inside and drop off the food together. Maybe one of the orders is a mistake." The two of them got off their scooters and approached the house. Ryan rang the doorbell. Several moments passed, but there was no response. The other driver smiled again and said, "Maybe it's too late. Let's go in and leave the food inside." Ryan hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed, figuring it wouldn't hurt. The door, oddly enough, was unlocked. As they stepped inside, a cold, eerie chill filled the air. The mansion's interior was old and decayed, with furniture covered in dust. Everything looked as if it had been left untouched for decades. A faint sound came from somewhere deep inside the house, but when Ryan turned to look, nothing was there. The other driver urged him to leave the food and go, but as Ryan placed the bag on a dusty table, a strange light flickered from down the hallway. Ryan, feeling unsettled, whispered, "We should get out of here. Something's not right." The other driver seemed unnervingly calm. "Relax, it's just an old house," he said nonchalantly. But Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they moved toward the door, strange whispers began to echo from the walls. Ryan stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. The man smiled again, his expression eerie. "The house is full of voices," he replied. "Don't worry about it." Ryan's fear grew stronger. He rushed toward the door, but when he reached it, the man was no longer behind him. He spun around, scanning the room, but the other driver had vanished without a trace. A shadowy figure seemed to hover in the distance, slowly fading away into the darkness. "What the hell?" Ryan muttered under his breath, his voice shaking. He tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, a deep, raspy voice echoed from the hallway behind him. "You will soon be one of us." Panicked, Ryan bolted for the door, but it remained firmly shut. Desperate, he turned back toward the room, but the house was eerily quiet. His heart was pounding in his chest. The only thing that remained was the unsettling sound of his own breathing. Ryan's gaze darted toward the window. The house, once bathed in the soft glow of dim lights, now felt darker than ever. He could feel the cold breath of something unseen brushing against his neck. He took a deep breath and slammed against the door again, this time with more force. Suddenly, the door swung open and Ryan stumbled outside. Gasping for air, he looked around frantically. The other driver's scooter was still parked next to his, but the man himself was nowhere to be seen. Ryan's blood ran cold. He quickly jumped on his scooter, trying to shake off the feeling of dread, but something stopped him in his tracks. The man was back, sitting on his scooter as if he had never left, his face now visible under the dim streetlight. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were completely blank, lifeless. He smiled again, but this time it was a hollow, unnatural smile. "You can't leave," he whispered. "No one ever leaves this place." Ryan's hands trembled as he frantically tried to start his scooter. The engine roared to life, and he sped down the road as fast as he could. The chilling sound of the other man's scooter followed closely behind. Ryan pushed the throttle as hard as he could, but no matter how fast he went, the sound of the second scooter never faded. It was always right behind him, lurking in the shadows. He glanced back, but nothing was there, only the empty, dark road. He finally reached the city limits, and the sound of the second scooter disappeared. Breathing heavily, Ryan pulled over to the side of the road. He tried to convince himself it had all been a bad dream, a trick of his imagination. But just as he turned off his scooter and stepped onto the sidewalk, he heard it again. The distant hum of a second scooter, slowly getting closer from right behind him.